One of these first materials we're going to start with when we're discussing tileable textures is going to be felt. And the technique I'm going to use to create this felt can really be applied to lots of different cloth and fabric kind of textures. And it's really thinking about the combination of diffuse, specular, and bump. And I'm actually going to get all the information I need from just a single diffuse texture that I sourced that is just a really nice quality. In this case, it's going to be felt. So let me pull that up real quick. And there it is. So you can see it's just a really beautiful scan. There's lots of detail. All the little fibers are very visible, and this is actually seamless as well. So these will be included in the DVD, so you'll be able to play around with it. So you can see our scene set up here. So we've got our Gnomon shader ball, and I've draped a nice polygon plain piece of fabric over top of it. And I'm actually going to be doing this in the Studio Light setup. And then we're going to go and create our shader right here. Normally I'll have my node editor on a full complete monitor, and just so I have lots of room to move around. And so I'm going to try and get everything crammed in here. And I'll probably just go ahead and move this over a little bit, and we'll just keep our render right here. Another one of the key things I really like to do, let me actually go to my shot cam here. When I'm working on stuff like this, I really like to just keep my IPR open and running almost the whole time. In V-Ray 3, the IPR is extremely stable, and it's a straight up progressive render, which means it's going to match your final render 1-to-1. And you don't really have to worry about like the old V-Ray RT kind of being different, anything like that. So you can just really keep it open while you're look deving. And I think I may have mentioned this already, but my computer I'm working on is nothing special. It is decent. I can show you the specs here, one sec. So you can see it's a 4930K Intel and 32 gigs of RAM. If you're ever doing effects work or something like that, you probably want to bump that up to 64. But anyways, point being, this is just a single CPU workstation. This is a really good processor, but it's not the top of the line one or anything. And so, you know, you can definitely don't feel hindered if you don't have the best graphic or the best card in the world. All right, so let's get started here. So I'm going to get my IPR rolling. There we go. And I'm going to start by just bringing in my color texture. So let me get this. I'm going to have to find a nice balance with all of this. And I think we can probably do something that looks pretty good. And then we can shrink our attribute editor over here. So let's grab, these are going to be in the textures chapter. And I actually, I've included some other fabrics as well. You can see there's, you know, a kind of stitched pattern. There's a knit texture in here. I'm going to be using this gray felt. So right off the bat, let me just connect that and control middle click dragging, and just going to connect that to the diffuse color. So I am not using the linear workflow checkbox, so I do want to make sure I'm gamma correcting my textures as needed. So I'm going to do a texture input gamma there. And so there's the correctly viewed texture. And so right off the bat, nothing too amazing, but I'm just going to get a duplicate of this. And this duplicate, I'm actually going to turn off that texture input gamma and get it plugged in my bump map. Now, the reason I'm doing that is because I actually don't want there to be any sort of gamma correction on my texture going into a bump map, because I just want to use the gray values as they exist in the space they are in. I don't need to gamma correct them at all for that. The reason I'm gamma correcting my texture for the viewer here in the color is because I'm applying a correction already that's pretty similar to sRGB, and I'm technically lifting this viewer up in gamma so it displays properly, and then I need to bounce my textures back down in gamma. Cool, so let's get our bump map dialed in here. So this is definitely a little extreme, so maybe we'll try 0.25. And I can just sample a little area here that I want to look at. That actually looks pretty good. And so this is already kind of grayscale, so I don't need to, I actually, you know, because this was scanned, the white pieces of fuzz that are towards the top are actually brighter white anyways. So this texture is already good to go for a bump map. I don't need to do any type of remapping or anything on this right now for the bump specifically. And so that's cool. Looks pretty good. And this is seamless also, so I do want to get some tiling going here. Let's try 4. There we go. So it's starting to feel kind of like concrete, but we can start playing around with the shader a little bit. So we can spread the diffuse a little bit so that it darkens in areas that are getting different variations of light. So we can use our roughness slider here. And I usually will just bring that up a tiny bit. I did a test with a camera in a full 360. If you ever want to see the roughness, what it looks like, you can set up a flat polygon plane and you can put a V-Ray sun and sky and render panoramic images, and you can see how the glancing angles away from the light are reacting with the roughness, and you'll actually get darker areas at opposite angles. It's a pretty cool effect. But maybe a little bit more. And you can always overcrank this to see what it's doing. So see, that really just kind of killed all of that diffuse going across it, and it made it feel very muted and a little bit weird. So I definitely don't need a lot of that. I do want to still see some of that shaping in there. Cool. And now probably the most important part of this shader is really going to be these reflections. So I'm just going to start with this pretty high. And I know felt is just really very, very soft. So I'm just going to lower this reflection glossiness quite a bit. And there you go. You can already see how this is taking on a bit of a soft kind of clothy feel to it. It feels a little bit heavy right now. And so we're going to get in there and start modifying this a bit. You can also play around. Phong sometimes has a little bit more of an organic roll-off in the specular. So you can see that actually I don't really like the way that looks. I actually really liked how the blend looked in this case. I feel like it was softer. Cool. That's feeling pretty nice. The bump might be a little bit heavy, but we'll play around with some of the other parts of the shader first. So one of the main tricks with cloth that I really wanted to show, especially with really soft cloth types like this, and also with things like velvet or satin or silk, is really getting variation in the diffuse. So you can do this a couple ways. I actually like to have full control over it with a sampler, the old school sampler info into a ramp. And let me get this ramp here. There we go. So I don't need the place 2D texture because the sampler info is taking care of it. And so I'm going to put the that connection here is the facing ratio into the V coordinate because it's a V ramp. And now I'm just going to, just right off the bat, let me just map that into the diffuse color so you can see what it's doing. If you've never seen this trick before, it's just literally the same thing as a Fresnel. It's just putting a darker color on the edge compared to right now a lighter color in the center. So you may, this may look a little more familiar if you have that darkness in the center and lighter on the edges. So something like that. So what I'm going to do is you can actually already see how that, even though it's very, very contrasty right now, that almost adds a little bit of softness to it. So what I'm going to do, that remap ramp, if you've never done this before, I'm going to be doing this a whole lot over the course of this chapter. And this is really, this is essentially a colorize levels all mixed into one. It's converting your RGB to hue saturation value and then mapping that into the ramp here. So you can see, let me just map my remap into my felt. So the dark points are right now, this almost looks the same because the dark points are getting mapped to black and the light to white. So it's just essentially desaturating an image that's already desaturated. But if I go in, you can see I was playing around with some nice blue hues here. So let me get some of that going. And something like that. So there's a bit of a gradient happening already. And this by gradient, I mean anywhere where those little white pieces were poking up, they'll get the lighter colors, so something like that. And then you can see if I, just to really show the effect here, so actually just by doing that, I realized that I'm really not getting this color anywhere unless I bring it lower. There we go. So now you can see almost that speckly pattern be very extreme. And so, you know, I don't really want it this extreme just so we can visualize it. And now I can ease off of this a bit so that it's much more of a gradient. So I'm essentially going to have two of these remap nodes going into my ramp here. So my ramp, this was my light edge value, so I'm going to map that into my light color. And I'm actually going to duplicate this remap ramp, and when I do it, I'm going to do duplicate special, and I'm going to just duplicate the input connections here so that it creates all the same ones and I get a brand new ramp. This ramp is going to be for the inner darker bits. I'm going to dial this down to maybe a little more saturated. And then the darker end, again, can also maybe even be fully saturated, something like that. And this is going to go into the dark end of that ramp. And let's get this ramp connected. And then let me regraph this shader here so we can see what's going on. So we've got our gray felt getting remapped twice. So now I need to kind of dial this around a little bit. I really think the dark is a little too dark, and I think the light is a little too chalky. So let's start with the dark. We'll get that a little bit brighter. I think I want it to be a lot more set, almost maybe a little bit of green. And we'll get that brighter. Full saturation, there we go. So that feels like more like a felt now. I think it was just missing that richness. The bump could be a little heavy too. Let's go in here and dial that down. There we go. And now on the edge, let's get that just brighter overall as well. There we go. Because the idea here is really that it just feels soft. Overall, I just want it to be as soft as possible. So that's feeling pretty cool. We'll let some of that kind of render in here. And I feel like I need to adjust my specular a little bit. So the highlight, the glosses might be a little too soft. Let's ease off of that a little bit. So you can see that's starting to show a little bit more highlights on the edges. And now I can ease off of my Fresnel as well. There we go. So the 1.33 value, that is the index of refraction of water. And so I tend to use it for organic objects. So, you know, this fabric is made from some sort of animal hair, like wool or something like that. So I kind of opted to do that. If it was more synthetic, I might raise that a little bit because then it might have a little bit more of a plasticky feel to it. So you can see I can also, you know, just dialing this by eye, I can bring a little bit of that back in too, so I get a stronger reflection. Maybe that will help it feel a little softer as well. And I think right now I'm still getting a little too much darkness on the front facing areas. So I'm going to go to this one here, and I want to bring this a little bit more back towards the blue. Maybe ease off some of that saturation a little bit. I don't want it to be too different. There we go. Because you should really just kind of feel that transition of color. It shouldn't be that intense of a change. Great, that's feeling pretty nice. And if we go over here, you know, I've created something that I could potentially just pump any texture into, which is pretty cool. But the same setup that I've got, I could reuse for other fabric types that are going in as my main texture here. And, you know, you could also start doing things like each of these, like maybe especially on my dark one, I could start introducing some noise, or maybe there's a procedural texture in each of these colors of the ramp, or maybe even two different felt textures that get kind of combined together to add a little bit of additional texture. So you can see how the shaders can start getting fairly large and, just really do some cool stuff with it. So the last thing I like to do with cloth like this, I do tend to, and I don't know if this is necessarily physically correct, but I do tend to tint the reflection a little bit. I feel like that helps with the softness. And so it just, it doesn't feel as plasticky, and it feels a little bit more organic that way. You can actually see the differences pretty nice there. So maybe a little bit less bump. Cool. And that's looking pretty good. So let's duplicate this shader. And now we have a brand new version of all of this. So you can see this is felt material 1. And let's go ahead and change my input texture here. So for the color, rather than the felt, let's grab the knit. And let's also change this one here. And because that didn't update immediately, I am just going to go ahead and restart my IPR. And so by the way, that felt shader that we just created will be in the Hypershade. So I'm saving out this file called Chapter 4 Material Types, and you'll just have access to all of these materials. So there's the Chapter 4 Material Types. Cool. So now let's, oh, that's not assigned. That's why it's not updating. And there we go. So hopefully that'll update now. Yep. So it's different. But I need to, let's first adjust the tiling. So let's just try even 1. And I do want to start adjusting the color on this one because this is a pretty different material. So with this one, so you can see it there. So let's try bumping up the bump amount here. And actually, it's kind of amazing that that doesn't look half bad, even like that. So it's pretty cool. I actually only assigned it to the cloth object. I didn't assign it to the sphere yet. So I can do that as well. And you can see because these materials, they share many of the same properties. And so, the way they reflect and just the way they interact with the world is very similar. Being a knit, there's a lot of, texture in it, and it reflects light kind of similarly to felt. The felt would have a much softer Fresnel than the knit. And so, maybe I could dial down some of my specular a bit. And so this is actually a very common question I get is, do you use the amount or the reflection color first? And honestly, I feel it's up to you. Personally, the way I think about it is that my reflection color is reserved for just that color, and I use the amount as a multiplier. So I will usually try to get my color established how I want it first. So in this case, I'm going to desaturate it. I can pull it down a little bit here too. And then if I need to do a smaller adjustment, especially if this was a file texture pumping in here, I can use my amount to dial it up and down as need be. And I'm just really looking at my IPR here and seeing everything, how it's looking. So that's pretty cool. So now we can go in and change our ramps around a little bit so we can make this red. Oh, wow, look at that. Some kind of mixed cloth action. So I'm just really adjusting the hues right now because I actually really like how the values are working. And then I'll do the same thing here. And you notice how that one I left a little bit orange. And maybe this one can even be a little bit yellow. Or maybe orange. So that feels actually, it feels totally weird to me now that I did it. So I'm just going to set that to red. And maybe this darker one can be, I actually honestly think this should be a little bit darker as well here. I think that extremeness of that fall off in the color is a little too much in the ramp. And so, so there you go. Pretty cool. You can just kind of get it. Just with this one shader setup, we've changed the material type. So we can see how that reacts with let's get our shader named here so that everything's set up okay. And remember, it's always easiest to just do this stuff as you're working rather than going back and having to start over or go through every single shader rather. So if we were to check out this shader, I broke one of my own rules here. I'm on my master layer, which is great. So if I was on one of the render layers, the file is set up, our look dev file that we set up last chapter, so that we have a basic Studio Light setup. I believe Studio A is in the master layer. If you look, the other lights that are in here are hidden. All of the dome, the HDRIs are hidden as well. So that makes it so that you can assign your shaders in the master layer, and then you can go and switch to these other layers to see what the shader looks like inside of them as well. So you can kind of see our little look dev scene in action now. So that's pretty cool. And so see, I may have assigned a shader in this render layer, which is why now I have a render layer override in this. So best thing to do, I can go ahead and assign something else if I want to, but it's fine for now. I actually was kind of curious how it would look with the blue anyways. And so if we stop that, I'm actually going to see if we can get some textures going here. There we go, that's better. So I just hit 6. And now you can see it's switching. So that one's a little bit unfortunate. I already screwed up my shader ball scene. That's okay. And so let's see how it looks in the sun and sky. Beautiful. So see, this is kind of interesting. Because this is a harder light, I very much feel like that bump is way too high. Notice how overall it feels almost more like rubber. And I attribute that solely to the bump being too high. So I do want to go in here and let's dial that bump down a little bit. So this is why we have the multiple light setups, so that I can go in and really kind of see this stuff and get a good gauge on it. So that feels a little bit better, a little bit more. It still definitely feels rougher in this environment. So I'm going to go see if I can turn my, the reflection's also still blue. That could potentially not be helping. So that's kind of cool. And let's give this a slightly softer reflection. Maybe crank that up a little bit. And maybe on this one we want to set this to 1.33. Something around there, that feels okay. Kind of interesting. Okay, so that's not feeling as nice as I wanted it to, but it will do. And let's check out the Harbor light rig. So this one feels pretty nice. This shader definitely feels nicer in the softer light, which is definitely interesting. So let's go back to the master layer. Let's get that blue felt shader assigned to all of our pieces here. So felt material. And let's see what the felt looks like in the sunlight. Kind of curious about this. So this to me is really what Look Dev is all about. Going in and doing your best to create a shader that will hold up in all of these different environments. And so you're really trying to create a scene for yourself that is representative of a lot of the environments that this shader is going to be going into. So see, the felt definitely holds up a little bit nicer. So we may need to tweak the specular on the knit a little bit, but the felt's feeling pretty cool.
So coming up next, I want to show how to transform this into a satiny, silky shader. Something with a much harder highlight, and we can play around with some anisotropy as well. So let's go ahead and graph this. We've got our felt material now. We're going to switch back over to our master layer, and I am going to duplicate this shader again. So I'm going to go to my duplicate special. I've got duplicate input graph turned on, and we can graph our new felt one. And we'll just assign this to everything. Oops. There we go. And we'll call this silk. Cool. So the main difference here that I really want to show is first the real difference in the diffuse. So actually I'm going to use a similar trick using the sampler info here. So we'll just delete some of this remapping that's happening. So first thing I want to get a new fabric texture here. So you can see this one's got much more tightly knit thread. So I'm going to map that in, and we'll get it mapped into the bump map as well. And we'll adjust the tiling up maybe a little higher to something like 6, right around in there. And let's start out by breaking these connections. And we will just kind of tuck this off to the side in case I need it. But really what I want to do, we'll do like a red silk. So we'll do this dark red. And actually, so that's the edge right there. So we'll do a lighter red and then a darker red. And so I do want to map this into my diffuse color. And even for right now, I'm just going to turn my reflection off so you can really see the power of just a simple sampler info and ramp combination here. And there we go. So, this, as we see it, is a very, very beautiful, almost like a velvety feel. You can see if I was to go in on this ramp and do some sort of noise of some kind. Let me see here. So, or maybe more like a solid fractal, something like this. Just something kind of subtle. If I was to remap this, and again do similar, so we'll do dark red. Oops. And a little bit lighter, so just a little bit of noise in there. And then this can be my dark color. That'll help get a little bit of breakup in there, which is awesome. And you can actually see we're getting the center part of that fractals clipping out. So because this is one single color, I may want to go in here and actually have it blend a little bit so I can do this. So see, now it'll blend in and out of those patches a little bit nicer. And maybe we can darken this down a little bit so it's not as intense. And I can always get rid of this guy and recreate it and just really ever so slightly bring that up. So we get a little bit of contrast in there. Need a little bit more. And I'm worried that that's not updating, so I'm going to restart my IPR. Sometimes the IPR gets a little funky when you're dealing with the remaps. Lots of little tweaks that are always going to be kind of consistently happening in these shaders. Oh yeah, so there we go. So maybe a little bit lower. So I'm looking at this area and through here. It's pretty cool. Yep, perfect. So yeah, so that's awesome. Just a really simple red velvety feel to it. And I can also go in and I can duplicate this. So I can say duplicate special with my input connections. And again, I can do same thing. This is my ramp. So this is the lighter color. So I'm going to start all the noise on this much lighter. And so maybe we'll darken down that middle point a little bit. And then we'll do that lighter one on the edge. So now you can see that nice breakup happening. So it almost has a specular quality happening in the diffuse, which is kind of cool. And now we can start using the specular to amp this up a little bit. So again, this is still kind of a velvet. So the silk hasn't really come into play yet, but I can even duplicate this out just because it's kind of a cool thing that happened while we were showing this. So let me rename this velvet. There we go. And so we can just bring in a little bit of specular here. And that can be also a pretty dark red. And the velvet would have a very soft feel like this. And we'll keep that for now a little lower so that specular is really only happening on the edges. And I could even use my same noise map going into that as well. I could also even get a V-Ray bump material. And I could go in and map this as my base material. I can use my solid fractal as the bump map. And we can just drag that in there. So obviously it's huge right now, but if we really, really keep this very, very subtle, we might get some pretty cool effects with it. Because velvet almost has a little bit of a broken up tooth across it. So that's kind of nice. And yeah, pretty cool stuff. It's looking really nice. So now let's duplicate this out. So we'll save this one. And we'll turn this into our silk. So I'm just going to duplicate special. And we'll say duplicate input graph. And really, I don't need the bump material. I'm not really going to be using that. So I'll just duplicate from the velvet material. And we'll just go ahead and assign that duplicated shader there and graph all of that. So this will be our silky shader. There we go. Cool. So on this one, we can maintain this ramp, but I am going to delete the noise going into it because the silk is going to be a much cleaner texture. When I added that noise, it really felt pretty velvety, so we'll just get rid of those for right now. And what I want to do here is start playing around with the specular and get it pretty sharp. So I'm going to make it pretty bright. And we'll start bringing this reflection glossiness up. So something around in there. And you can try even making this a little yellow. So something to go with the red and play against it almost. It's pretty cool. So this feels a little bit strange right now, but what we're looking at is only reflection and not the actual specular. Because what I want to do is actually start playing around with some of this anisotropy. So you'll notice in this light setup right now, if I start adjusting this anisotropy, you can see it's changing up here, but it's not really changing in my render at the moment. And you can see there's some really subtle stuff happening up here. And that's really because the specular is so large and soft, I'm really only seeing the reflection of those cards right now, not the stretching of the specular. So let's take this shader that we just created and bring it up into the sun and sky. And we'll do test render in here. There we go. So now we can actually visualize some of those specular hits that we're getting, and we can start seeing what they look like in different situations. So let's go ahead and go over to our Silky shader here. And it might be a little sharp, so let's pull that down. So see, that's pretty cool. And now we can also, I think my specular should be going this way. Yes, so you can see how it stretches across the lines of the folds in those fabric right there. That's really the effect that I'm looking for. And so I'm actually going to use another ramp. I'm going to just say edit duplicate special. I'm going to this time duplicate input connections so that we maintain that same sampler info. And this is going to be the reflections. So we can maybe have that warmer orangish pink color on the edge, and then we'll actually have a pretty saturated red in the middle. And we'll see what this looks like. I just kind of, I just really guess here. There's no exact science, right or wrong, going into this. But I do want you to know also, I do keep reference open while I'm doing this, and I highly recommend that. Let me pull it up real quick. So this is the reference I'm using for the silk right now. And you can see, just even comparing this, I'm still missing quite a bit. The specular is a little too sharp, and I think that the specular should be a more saturated red rather than the warmth, if I'm matching this exactly. But I have some creative freedom with this too, so we can continue to play around with it. So the warmer specular to me is almost when there's like a golden thread mixed in. Kind of makes it feel expensive, which I kind of like. But if I wanted to match exactly what I had up there, I can start cranking up the values on these speculars. And let's try just getting them just really full saturation red. And see, that's going to start getting that that feeling there. And I could also go in and play with this Fresnel a little bit. I'm not sure if I'm going to be too happy with it, but we'll see what it does. It's kind of cool. And even try stretching that specular up. See, it started doing some weird stuff. So maybe rather than stretching the Fresnel too much, I can soften that specular a bit as well. Could even try some of these other specular types to see if I get anything cool. The GGX is really for metal. I really shouldn't be using that. I think the blend is pretty good. The Fong would be cool, except you can't do anisotropy with a Fong. So we are going to go back to the blend. So let's see how this looks in some of our other lighting situations. So this is our Studio B, which is interesting. Again, there's no real hard specular here, but let's see what that, if I turn down my diffuse completely. So that's the result of my specular, which is actually very interesting. And so maybe I do want a little bit less diffuse. I also do think that my reflection being solid red here is not a good idea. So I kind of liked that warmth. Maybe we should try smooth ramp interpolation. Maybe we can desaturate that a little bit as well. So no, that's kind of nice. That has a nice feel to it. So let's see what this feels like in maybe the bunker. So that's kind of interesting. Feels a little heavier, which I'm not sure how I feel about. but it's getting there. It's a nice feel to it. And then our backyard. Oh yeah, so this is our issue here. So I actually, to fix this, how the blue is connected here, I'm actually going to delete this shading group. And it'll lose that connection to that render layer. And then when you open this file up, if you assign the felt material, it'll automatically create a new one. So cool. So feeling pretty good about this. Can go ahead and do a quick render in the harbor as well, just see what it looks like. The harbors definitely leaves the most to be desired. There's no real strong specular in this scene, so maybe this is what silk would look like in this environment. I can even try this if I put a point light in here. And let's just try and get some, so immediately off of that single point light, we start getting those beautiful specular. So I would take it with a grain of salt, definitely keep an eye on it and see what it looks like in the different environments and play around. But generally speaking, I'm pretty happy with this shader at the moment. So cool. These shaders will all be in this file. I've renamed it to material types _ cloth. And I'm going to break these out into multiple files for chapter 4. So the next one's going to be metal.